I'm going to try and make my conception of philosophy and its relationship to the history of philosophy clearer by reflecting upon the debate between Russell and Wittgenstein about the nature of judgment. It might be better to actually put it in first order rather than second order terms. I will try and make clear how my conception of reality has been informed by reading the seminal exchanges between these great historical figures about how order arises in the world and how thought directs itself upon these ordered things we find in the world. Okay, so what was I'm claiming to share a conception of philosophy with the early analytic philosophers in Cambridge. One thing that was deeply important to them in the conception of philosophy they advanced at that time was the necessity for relations. Russell, looking back in a survey paper called Logical Atomism in 1924, in a volume dedicated to assessing the state of philosophy at the time, said the question of relations is one of the most important that arises in philosophy, as most other issues turn on it. Well, why did he say that? Why did he say these things? Well, order is a fundamental feature of the world we inhabit. We find things and events arranged in space and time. We find events arranged by causation, configured according to the laws of nature, apt to be counted and measured by placing the things which are here in the material world in some sort of correspondence to abstract items described by mathematics. Our thought and our talk reaches out to describe and reflect upon the things we find ordered in the world. But how is any of this possible? If order isn't possible, then we will have to condemn what science and common sense say about the world to the bin of appearances and self-contradictions. If there is no order, then the true reality, which cannot be ordered, will be confined to inscrutable something, concealed behind the phantasmagoria of number, space, time, and matter. And indeed, that was exactly the conception that Bradley proposed in 1893 in his Appearance in Reality. The world we encounter, because it fundamentally consists in things related to one another in these ordered ways, cannot ultimately be intelligible, must be mere appearance, because order is unintelligible. So reality must be something fundamentally unordered, but which, since we don't encounter it, remains ultimately inscrutable to us. Now, Bradley had some 2 or 3 famous arguments designed to convince us that order was impossible, there could be no relations. I'll just briefly mention his famous regress argument, which he arrived at by reflecting upon Zeno's paradoxes about motion. If a relation is to relate some things, then it must either be something to those things it relates, or it must be nothing. If it's nothing to the things that it relates, then it can't relate them. But that means it must be something to them. But if it's something to them, then it must be related to the things that it relates. So we need to, in order to explain how a relation relates, we need another relation to relate it to the things it relates. Then by the same line of reflection for the something with respect to which the first relation stands to its relater, we have a further relation, and so on. Now, we don't need to concern ourselves with the details of that argument right here. Moore and Russell went to some efforts to address that concern. But they said something more important, I think, than the details of those particular arguments. So far as Moore and Russell, this is on your handout, were concerned, nothing said by a philosopher could possibly justify drawing the conclusion that there was no order in the world. It doesn't matter what their argument is. We are far more certain of the findings of science and common sense than of the validity and soundness of any philosophical argument deployed against them. The reasoning here was later developed by Moore in his defense of common sense realism about the external world. He famously offered to refute the skeptic by holding up his hands and saying, "Here are hands." And he thought that, namely, here are 2 external world items. And he thought there was no philosophical argument you could raise against the validity and soundness of that argument, whose character was more certain than the argument that I just gave. Here's how Russell spelt this thought out, again from 1924, but you find it as early on in 1903 in his Principles of Mathematics. He says, "I do not believe, for instance, that those who disbelieve in the reality of relations can possibly interpret those numerous parts of science which employ asymmetrical relations." That's relations that place things in an order. "Even if I could see no way of answering the objections to relations raised, for example, by Mr. Bradley, his regress arguments, I should still think it more likely than not that some answer was possible. because I should think an error in a very subtle and abstract argument more probable than so fundamental a falsehood in science. Admitting that everything we believe ourselves to know is doubtful, it seems nevertheless that what we believe ourselves to know in philosophy is more doubtful than the details of science, though perhaps not more doubtful than its most sweeping generalizations. So it's because we are certain, or relatively certain, of what science and common sense tell us, that philosophy has to ultimately to be constrained to make sense of what science and common sense say, to understand how ultimately the things said by science and common sense can hang together in a unified synoptic world vision. However, this doesn't end the philosophical enterprise, because admitting that we need, or affirming that relations are necessary to our worldview, doesn't tell us what relations are. And what I'd like us to talk about a little bit today is some of the specific accounts that Russell provided, micro-explanations, if you will, of how relations actually succeed in fulfilling the metaphysical responsibility fallen to them of explaining how order arises. I said earlier that so I'm skeptical of there being any fulfilling or deeply enlightening metaphilosophy. It's a familiar thought that to most philosophers, that a lot of concepts you can't get at them by giving necessary and sufficient conditions, but only actually by pointing to their instances and enabling the person who's not already who hasn't already acquired them to pointing to their instances and helping the student to get along by using these concepts. I think that ultimately what that shows is often you can't get at what philosophy is except by doing some philosophy and pointing at instances to it. So by doing that now, I think, what I think I'm doing is explaining my conception of philosophy by giving you an instance of what I think is a paradigm of philosophical investigation, namely adjudicating or trying to come to terms with these micro-explanations that Russell has offered us. Okay, so what are these micro-explanations? Well, there are essentially two in the earlier period of Russell's life. The first, which arose in around 1903, is the view that relations are essentially endowed with what Frege called sense, or sometimes direction, not to be confused with Frege's notion of sense, for those who are interested in Frege. This view was destined to become the mainstream view amongst philosophers. Indeed, I think it still is the mainstream view amongst philosophers. Let me point you to what he says here. A relational proposition may be symbolized by A or B, where R is the relation and A and B are the terms. Then he says, and A or B will then always, provided A and B are not identical, denote a different proposition from B or A. Okay, now we get the idea of direction. That is to say, it's a characteristic of a relation of two terms that it proceeds, so to speak, from one end, A, to the other, B. And this is what we call the sense of the relation, and is we shall find the source of order and series in the world. So there's this fundamental idea that what's distinctive of relations, which allows things to come first and then second and then third, is that there's a direction involved, applying first to A, then to B, being born from A to B, a direction of travel. With this notion of direction in play, we can now go on to define another type of relation, which is a converse relation, which is simply the same relation of, as it were, exactly the same material content, but which holds in the opposite direction. So the relation which holds between B and A, whenever R holds between A and B, will be called the converse of R. And so by difference of sense or direction, I mean in the present discussion at least the difference between an asymmetrical sign and its converse. And we have, of course, lots of signs in natural language which exhibit this duality. So is taller than goes in one direction between me and Martin, but there's another relation, is shorter than, which goes in the opposite direction, above and below, greater and less, before and after, and so on. All of these are fundamental relations in this early view of Russell's. However, in 1913, he made a dramatic volte-face. He said the following, the top of the next page of your handout. Looking away from everything psychological and considering only the external fact in virtue of which it's true to say that A is before B, it seems plain that this fact consists of two events, A and B, in succession, and that whether we choose to describe it by saying A is before B or by saying B is after A is a mere matter of language. So according to the early view, the 1903 view, Tim spoke before I did, and that's a different chunk of reality, a different state of the world, because it involves a different relation to me talking after Tim. According to the 1903 view, those are two different events. Tim's talking before and my talking after. But Russell very sensibly in 1913 says, no, it's just one and the same thing described from two different points of view. Really, saying A is before B is synonymous in some deep metaphysical sense with saying B is after A. It's not two different states or successions in play there. Let's call this argument Russell's synonymy argument. From this argument, he drew the following conclusion. We decided that before and after only differ linguistically. There's not a different reality corresponding to them. Hence, whatever a relation is, which is the question we're interested in here, it must be symmetrical with respect to its two ends. It must not be pictured as having a hook in front and an eye behind, but as having a hook at each end and is equally adapted for traveling in either direction. Well, I'm going to call this theory the neutral theory of relations. Relations don't have a direction. They don't travel in one way rather than another. And it was swiftly dropped. And Russell subsequently returned to his early view that relations are inherently directional. But why was this? Well, this is where we need to look at the debate between Russell and Wittgenstein. An example, and I'm using this as an example of how we can get clearer about what's going on in one part of a philosopher's discussion by looking at his exchange with the other philosophers on something which, on the face of it, is actually a distinct subject. Well, having introduced you to Russell's two theories of relations, I'd like you to introduce what relations are. I want to introduce you to two theories that Russell had adopted about the nature of judgment, an early and a late theory as well. At the turn of the 19th century, Moore and Russell conceived of propositions in a special way. They were essentially external items. Concerned to avoid the fate of the idealist philosophers in Oxford, they wanted to maximize our exposure of the human mind to what there is in reality, not to hide us behind a veil of appearances in the way that Bradley had suggested. So they made the contents of our minds, the propositions, not internal arrangements of ideas, but actually identified the propositions with complex unities composed of the very entities that intuitively we're thinking about. So famously, Russell declared to Russell in 1901 that when you think about Mont Blanc and all its snowfields is literally a constituent of your thought. There's no intermediary that you're acquainted with which gives you access to that proposition. Rather, your thought reaches directly out and encapsulates Mont Blanc with all its snowfields. That's what we're all doing right now. Judgment is then conceived as a binary relation between a subject and a proposition conceived of this external complex composed of the propositional constituents. So S judges that P gives the logical form of judgment, takes you from a subject to a proposition which is a unified complex entity. Now, Russell and Moore started to worry about what is this complex entity to which we're related by judgment. And in particular, what distinguishes this proposition, which is truth evaluable, from a mere list of its constituents. What distinguishes judging A or B from simply entertaining in one's mind A and then R and then B? Well, the answer that they gave at the time was the presence of a relating relation. I can think that Martin is taller than I am, and what I'm doing when I think that is thinking about a complex where taller than relates first Martin to me. But there's another proposition I can also entertain, which is that I am taller than Martin. What makes that a truth evaluable unity? Well, the answer is because its relation, so Martin's a good deal taller than me, if any of you are wondering. For me to think that I am taller than Martin, the relation has to really relate. So taller than does travel from me to Martin, just as it travels in the converse proposition from Martin to me. But how can that be? If it's false that I'm taller than Martin, how can the relation really relate? Well, Moore and Russell contemplated this for a while. Eventually they came down to the view that simply some complexes are true and others are false. There's no insight to be got into why some relations have a unity that results in truth, whereas others that don't. So here's Russell reflecting upon some related views of Meinong in Mind in 1904. What is truth and what falsehood we must merely apprehend, for both seem incapable of analysis. And as for the preference which most people feel in favour of true propositions, they must be based apparently upon an ultimate ethical principle. There's no insight to be had into why we prefer true propositions. The false propositions are just as much part of reality. Well, this is very mysterious, and so eventually by around 1908 or so, Russell gave up this theory. So now we go into his second theory. His first theory said that judgment was a binary relation between a subject and a proposition. His second theory was that judgment is a multiple relation. It's a relation which doesn't take you between a subject and a single proposition, but takes you between the subject and all the things that, intuitively speaking, that proposition is about. So here's his example of German's 1910 paper from Nature of Truth and Falsehood. So let us take the judgment A loves B. This consists of a relation of the person judging to A and love and B, i.e. to the terms A and B in the relation loves. But the judgment is not the same as the judgment B loves A. Thus the relation must not be abstractly before the mind, but must be before it as proceeding from A to B rather than from B to A. The corresponding complex, which is to make our judgments true, consists of A related to B by the relation which was before us in our judgment. And that probably takes a moment or two to digest, but the idea is instead of the mind simply embracing a proposition, you're to imagine the cognitive tentacles reaching out from your mind and then touching on the individual elements of a proposition, rather as you might touch on the notes of a keyboard to play a melody. It's the particular order in which the mind reaches out and touches upon the things it's thinking about that constitutes its being a proposition. And what you think is true, when the way in which the judgment relation touches upon the elements that you're thinking about corresponds to the way in which those things are actually arranged in the world. So the idea is that the fact that S judges in this way has just enough unity to render it truth valuable, but not so much as to make a mystery of the difference between true and false propositions. Why is this? Well, judging is not a mere list, because in judgment what happens is the cognitive relation of judgment reaches out and really relates me to taller than and to Martin. But that can very well be false, because even though the judgment relation reaches out and touches upon me, Martin, and taller than in that order, in actual fact, me is taller than and Martin are not arranged in the world in that order. So by thinking of truth as an extrinsic property of our judgment rather than an intrinsic feature, we can see how we can judge false propositions. Well, in order to get the theory precise, what you have to do is to explain what it means for the cognitive tentacles to touch upon the elements of a proposition in the right order, in the right way, and to conceive of the relation, as he puts it, proceeding from A to B. What does it mean to hold a relation before the mind is proceeding from A and B? Well, that was where Russell devoted his attention, and he tried in various ways to make sense of that. But then Wittgenstein arrived on the scene. So here's the hero, or I should say the anti-hero of our story. Russell was writing about these views in his Theory of Knowledge manuscript, which he abandoned as a result of Russell's criticisms in 1913. I've summed up some of the correspondence as printed here on the next page of your handout. Here's Russell writing to his lover of the time, Ottoline Morel. I showed him, Wittgenstein, a crucial part of what I've been writing. He said it was all wrong, not realizing the difficulties, that he had tried my view and knew it wouldn't work. I couldn't understand his objection. In fact, he was very inarticulate, but I felt in my bones that he must be right and that he has seen something I have missed. Russell carried on trying to work for a while, and then wrote again, I have only superficially and by an active will got over Wittgenstein's attack, and it has made the work a task rather than a joy. All that has gone wrong with me lately comes from Wittgenstein's attack on my work. I have only just realized this. It was very difficult to be honest about it, as it makes a large part of the book I meant to write impossible for years to come, probably. And there's a typo on the next line. For the first time in my life, I have failed to be honest over work. Well, what was it that Wittgenstein had said to Russell? Well, we have the following letter from June 1913. I can now express my objection to your theory of judgment exactly. I believe it's obvious that from the proposition A judges say that A is in the relation R to B, if correctly analysed, the proposition A or B or not A or B must follow directly without the use of any other premise. This condition is not fulfilled by your theory. Wittgenstein wrote a couple more times, I'm very sorry to hear that my objection to your theory of judgment paralyses you. I think it can only be removed by a correct theory of propositions. And then from Norway, every right theory of judgment must make it impossible for me to judge that this table pen holders the book. Russell's theory does not satisfy this requirement. Proper theory of judgment must make it impossible to judge nonsense. Well, an immense amount of effort has been devoted by philosophers trying to understand what this exchange amount to, often relating it off to the mathematical developments in Principia Mathematica. I think that's wrong. I think actually there's nothing more to the objection that is actually stated here on the page already. Basically what Wittgenstein is arguing is the multiple relation theory of judgment fails to exercise sufficient control over the concept of judgment because it does nothing to preclude the possibility of our being beset by an overabundance of judgment facts. We cannot judge, to use Wittgenstein's example, that this table pen holders the book. That's senseless to think the table pen holders the book. But the multiple relation theory doesn't tell us anything about the judgment relation that prevents the cognitive act of touching upon the table, the pen holder, and the book in that order, and therefore of judging that the table pen holders the book. Since the multiple relation theory doesn't rule that out, doesn't rule out our judging nonsense, it hasn't given us a good account of what judgment consists in. Well, for many years, Russell abandoned, in the next 3 or 4 years, the multiple relation theory, and then eventually adopted a theory very akin to Russell's theory of propositions as internal representations. So moving us back to the original conception that he and Moore had rejected. Let me return briefly to the subject of the neutral theory of relations. Philosophers have tried to understand, for many years the neutral theory of relations was barely mentioned at all, and just treated as a very idiosyncratic detail of a work on the theory of knowledge that Russell had abandoned. However, recently Russell scholars have sought to link the abandonment of the neutral relation theory and the multiple relation theory of judgment to Wittgenstein's criticisms. And this, I think, can only be understood in terms of very negative impact of Wittgenstein upon some of his contemporaries and upon the history of philosophy. At the beginning of your handout, I quoted C.D. Broad from 1925. This is from his Mind in Its Place in Nature. He said, I'd like to know what this means actually. In the meanwhile, I retire to my well-earned bath chair, from which I shall watch with a fatherly eye the philosophical gambols of my younger friends as they dance to the highly syncopated pipings of Herr Wittgenstein's flute. And it's remarkable that that kind of influence Wittgenstein continues to assert. Ryle, in his obituary of Wittgenstein, talked about people who'd never met Wittgenstein were actually adopting his mannerisms and using his tone of voice, and students were wrinkling their noses at things that Wittgenstein had found distasteful without ever thinking why. For some reason, the charisma of the man has sort of reached down through us, and who knows, maybe I'm speaking now with some intonations and gestures that were typically his. But what recent Wittgenstein scholars have done is they've tried to interpret these criticisms as the abandonment of the neutral relation theory and the multiple relation theory as going hand in hand. So there's a quotation which I won't bother reading to you from Thomas Rickets, a notable scholar of this area of analytic philosophy, history of analytic philosophy, who thought that really, well, let me just read the beginning of it. Wittgenstein does not mention the problems that asymmetric relations pose for the theory. He doesn't mention the connection between the theory of relations and the multiple relation theory of judgment. However, on 20th of May 1913, immediately before Russell drafted the chapter in Theory of Knowledge in which he identifies relations and their converses, Wittgenstein in conversation presented Russell with objections to a previous version of the multiple relation theory. The chronology, combined with Russell's reversal of a position that had been stable since 1903, leads me to suspect that Wittgenstein was the source of the synonymy argument. That's the argument that says A is before B is the very same state as B is after A. So mere circumstantial evidence is used to explain why it is that Russell abandoned the theory, and the credit is given to Wittgenstein for coming up with a synonymy argument that makes the earlier theory of relations seem credible. But this can't be right, because Russell had already come up with a synonymy argument, sorry, I have a typo there, in 1903, when Wittgenstein was still only 14. And it can't really be credible that he'd already thought it up then. What we find in 1903, going back to the principles, he says there in the middle of that quotation, are A or B and B converse are A really different propositions, or do they only differ linguistically? Maybe held there's only one relation R, and that all necessary distinctions can be obtained from that between A or B and B or A. So this very same thought was actually present in 1903. So that wasn't really what was causing Russell to give up the neutral relation theory. Indeed, 11 days after Wittgenstein visited Russell, we actually find much later on in the manuscript a different reason for abandoning the neutral theory, which is the next quotation in your handout. One special objection is that in order to regard the associated complex as non-permutative, we have to regard its atomic constituents, x1, x, c1, y, gamma, and so on, as really its constituents. And what is more, we have to regard the corresponding propositions as constituents of the proposition. This seems to demand a mode of analyzing molecular propositions which requires the admission they may contain false atomic propositions as constituents, and therefore to demand the admission of false propositions in an objective sense. Now, this is a difficult passage, and I'm not surprised that most commentators have just passed over it, because it's actually very involved. What I want to be able to do now is to try and show you what that means rather quickly. To do that, I'll need to tell you a little bit more about how the neutral relation theory is supposed to work. Okay, so it's got 3 steps. Level 0 is basically the idea that we should be able to dismiss alternative conceptions of relations. So, the 1903 theory says that if we've got A is taller than B, that's a different state from B is shorter than A. The 1913 theory says it's the very same. Why believe that? Well, one theory might be that you feel wary of admitting both that Martin is taller than me and I am shorter than Martin. You might admit that's the very same state, but say that's because taller than has some sort of priority. Shorter than is just another way of saying that someone is taller than. But the problem there is that simply it's very difficult to say why there's priority in the taller person or why there's priority in the shorter person. So what Russell does is he runs through, I won't bother with the quotation, he runs through various examples and says that often you just cannot find any reason to give priority to one term rather than the other. I mean, it's not as though mathematicians are going to wake up one morning and discover that greater than is the true relation and we can delete less than from all the fundamental texts. So then what he does is he goes on to provide an alternative explanation. And his first explanation, which is the intuitive one, is that we distinguish relations in terms of argument positions, something like the idea that Frege had. So is taller than has got 2 positions in it, the position occupied by the taller thing and the position occupied in it by the smaller thing. And the difference between Martin is taller than Fraser and Fraser is taller than Martin is that in between those 2 propositions we've reversed our occupation of the argument positions. In the first one, Martin went into the first argument position, I went into the second. In the reverse proposition, we swap over like that. That's this level 1 analysis. The level 2 analysis that Russell offers is that we should, instead of thinking of positions as fundamental to our architecture of the universe, we think of relations as being fundamental. So instead of saying that I occupy a position of the argument position, don't think of the relation as having any structure of its own, but rather think of me as being related in a special way to the relation. In this case, the being taller than way to the relation. And sorry, that's the relation that is the metaphysical embodiment of occupying the first position, and then the being shorter than, that relation born to that relation, that's what constitutes occupying the second position. So instead of thinking, eventually we end up with a view here according to which what it means for A or B is for there to be some basic state or event. And what makes it the case that A or B rather than B or A is that there are further relations that relate A and B to that relation core. Now, if you look at the top of page 6 and read the second quotation, the sense of a relation, or the direction of a relation, is derived from the 2 different relations which the terms of a dual complex have to the complex which constitute position in the complex. Sense or direction is not in the relation alone or in the complex alone, but in the relations of the constituents to the complex which constitute position in the complex. So that's the position I was just trying to, the view I was trying to outline. So the idea is associated with any given relation. There's a variety of these positional relations which relate you to the things which you're related by. Now, here's the real problem. Here's my elucidation of the previous quotation. What we've got here is a theory, a neutral theory of relations that's incompatible with the multiple relation theory of judgment. Why so? In order to judge that A or B where R is asymmetric, the subject must be related to a variety of complexes which, intuitively speaking, locate A and B in the respective slots of R. So to believe that A or B is to think that there's one state whereby A is related to R in a certain kind of way, and there's another state in which B is related to R in the converse way. The problem is that if A, R, B isn't true, then those complexes won't exist. A and B will not lie in those relations to that underlying neutral relation. And so the subject cannot be multiply related to these complexes in order to judge the A or B. So the subject cannot intelligibly judge a false proposition. So roughly speaking, what's happening here is that because we need to think of Russell as thinking of any judgment of an asymmetric relation as being a quantified judgment, which involves quantifying over complexes. In the absence of those complexes, you can't even entertain the belief. Well, importantly, this isn't a new problem, but the resuscitation of an old problem, the problem of false propositions. Because remember, that was the problem which Russell had with his 1903 theory, which he became aware of in 1904 when Wittgenstein had now advanced to the age of 15. So we've got a succession of problems here which Russell is working out with his theory, which are not owed to Wittgenstein at all. In fact, are elaborating on what he said previously. So, what's the general claim that I'm making? So I'm going to wind up quite quickly now. What's the general claim that I'm making? It's that because people have tried to interpret the exchange between Russell and Wittgenstein in a way which gives priority to Wittgenstein having some insight that devastated his teacher. And often when you read commentary on these errors, there'll be talk of gross confusions and clumsy errors on the part of Russell and so on, whereas there's just this effortless brilliance where Wittgenstein just sees through to what's wrong with the theory without having to go through any details of the theory. In actual fact, I think that's a very wrong picture of the history of what actually happened. What we actually see here is Russell doing analytic work, figuring out that the neutral theory runs into various compatibilities and incompatibilities with other commitments that he has, and indeed ones which are indeed illuminating for us. So let me quickly say why I think that is. Well, the subsequent developments which are outlined on the remainder of your handout, what they do is they give further evidence, I think, that Russell wasn't being pushed and pulled simply by these criticisms that I've quoted from Wittgenstein. Why is that? Well, he gave up the neutral relation theory whilst continuing to hold on to the multiple relation theory of judgment. He didn't give them both up. He just gave up one of them. Indeed, he returned to the original theory of relations that they have direction, which is compatible with the multiple relation theory of judgment. What he subsequently went on to do was to try and offer further clarification of the multiple relation theory of judgment, which we find in his lectures on the philosophy of logical atomism. In these lectures are often described by commentators as simply being a no-theory theory. If you look at the top of page 7, Stewart Canlish, in his influential book on the Russell-Bradley dispute, says, "What is clear to Russell is that he has nothing better to offer in response to these difficulties, and at this point he leaves them unresolved. So poor old Russell, just not able to keep up the pace, just gives up." But I think that's actually very wrong. In fact, there are rich insights yet to be gleaned from the lectures on philosophy of logical atomism that Wittgensteinian commentators have left out. Let me just quickly conclude by saying what one of those insights really is. If you look at the next quotation, the third quotation down from page 226, he points out that I can believe that this is white and that 2 and 2 are 4. They are quite different forms, and yet one can believe both. So he's pointing out that indeed we can understand propositions of different forms. And a judgment relation should accommodate our being able to think judgments of different forms. Therefore, it would seem that belief cannot be strictly logically one in all different cases, but must be distinguished according to the nature of the proposition that you believe. This means that belief itself cannot be treated as being a proper sort of single term. Belief will really have to have different logical forms according to the nature of what is believed. So the apparent sameness of believing in different cases is more or less illusory. So there's no single judgment relation anymore. That's what's being given up. Now, how does that help us answer Wittgenstein's criticisms? What's the insight which I see lurking behind these remarks? Well, the insight is that what Wittgenstein's primary complaint was that if the cognitive judgment, if judgment is unconstrained, we can judge things in impossible orders and also impossible arrangements, and that wouldn't really be to judge at all. That's because in his early theory of judgment, all the different terms of what you're thinking about are all placed on a level. Now, we can address that worry by not thinking of things which we judge as being on a level. Rather, we need to think of judgment as having a logical articulation which gives a special focused position to the relations and distinguishes them from other mere objects. What I take this remark here to be that belief itself cannot be treated as a proper sort of single term is an effect which you might put in a slightly more logical way by saying that belief is a function. Belief is a function which will take you from relations as arguments and deliver as values something like judging in that particular kind of way. So in addition to the relation of loves, there's judging lovingly. So more generally, belief as a function that takes you from R to judging Rly. And the point about judging Rly is it's a way of judging in which the relation R does not itself appear, but which, because R is built into the content of the judgment, succeeds in relating A to B in a way which doesn't put R on a level alongside A and B. Well, there's a lot more to be said about these, but let me just give you the final line. My claim is that I've tried to give you an example of doing analytic philosophy in a way in which you learn from the history of analytic philosophy by seeing how there are different possibilities available. What this has done, I think, is it's shown us that there's a possibility of a new theory of judgment here, a multiple relation theory of judgment, which is truly externalist, but which admits the idea that judgment must be higher order, which has distinctive types of argument positions for universals. And also, I think, we see that there's another theory of relations which was dismissed because of its incompatibility with the multiple relation theory of judgment, which deserves more, which still promises insight, which is the neutral theory of relations. Thank you.